modified in the interest of their members. The new unions were founded at a time when the faith in the eternity of the wages system was severely shaken. Their founders and promoters were socialists either consciously or by feeling. The masses, whose adhesion gave them strength, were rough, neglected, looked down upon by the working-class aristocracy, but they had this immense advantage, that their minds were virgin soil, entirely free from the inherited respectable bourgeois prejudices which hamper the brains of the better-situated old unionists. And thus we see now these new unions taking the lead of the working-class movement generally, and more taking in tow the rich and proud old unions. Undoubtedly, the Eastenders have committed colossal blunders, so have their predecessors, and so do the doctrinaire socialists who pooh-pooh them. A large class, like a great nation, never learns better or quicker than by undergoing the consequences of its own mistakes. And for all the faults committed in past, present, and future, the revival of the East End of London remains one of the greatest and most fruitful facts of this fin de siècle, and glad and proud I am to have lived to see it. F. Engels, January 11, th. 1892. Introduction. The history of the proletariat in England begins with the second half of the last century, with the invention of the steam engine, and of machinery for working cotton. These inventions gave rise, as is well known, to an industrial revolution, a revolution which altered the whole civil society, one, the historical importance of which is only now beginning to be recognized. England is the classic soil of this transformation, which was all the mightier, the more silently it proceeded, and England is, therefore, the classic land of its chief product also, the proletariat. Only in England can the proletariat be studied in all its relations, and from all sides. We have not, here and now, to deal with the history of this revolution, nor with its vast importance for the present and the future. Such a delineation must be reserved for a future, more comprehensive work. For the moment, we must limit ourselves to the little that is necessary for understanding the facts that follow, for comprehending the present state of the English proletariat. Before the introduction of machinery, the spinning and weaving of raw materials was carried on in a working man's home. Wife and daughter spun the yarn that the father wove, or that they sold, if he did not work it up himself. These weaver families lived in the country in the neighborhood of the towns, and could get on fairly well with their wages, because the home market was almost the only one, and the crushing power of competition that came later, with the conquest of foreign markets and the extension of trade, did not yet press upon wages. There was, further, a constant increase in the demand for the home market, keeping pace with the slow increase in population, and employing all the workers, and there was also the impossibility of vigorous competition of the workers among themselves, consequent upon the rural dispersion of their homes. So it was, that the weaver was usually in a position to lay by something, and rent a little piece of land, that he cultivated in his leisure hours, of which he had as many as he chose to take, since he could weave whenever, and as long as he pleased. True, he was a bad farmer, and managed his land inefficiently, often obtaining but poor crops. Nevertheless, he was no proletarian, he had a stake in the country, he was permanently settled, and stood one step higher in society than the English workman of today. So the workers vegetated throughout a passably comfortable existence, leading a righteous and peaceful life in all piety and probity, and their material position was far better than that of their successors. They did not need to overwork, they did no more than they chose to do, and yet earned what they needed. They had leisure for healthful work in garden or field, work which, in itself, was recreation for them, and they could take part besides in the recreations and games of their neighbors, and all these games, bowling, cricket, football, etc., contributed to their physical health and vigor. They were, for the most part, strong, well-built people, in whose physique little or no difference from that of their peasant neighbors was discoverable. Their children grew up in the fresh country air, and, if they could help their parents at work, it was only occasionally, while of 8 or 12 hours' work for them there was no question. What the moral and intellectual character of this class was may be guessed. Shut off from the towns, which they never entered, their yarn and woven stuff being delivered to traveling agents for payment of wages, so shut off that old people who lived quite in the neighborhood of the town never went thither, until they were robbed of their trade by the introduction of machinery, and obliged to look about them in the towns for work. The weavers stood upon the moral and intellectual plane of the yeomen with whom they were usually immediately connected through their little holdings. They regarded their squire, the greatest landholder of the region, as their natural superior. They asked advice of him, laid their small disputes before him for settlement, and gave him all honor, as this patriarchal relation involved. They were respectable people, good husbands and fathers, led moral lives, because they had no temptation to be immoral, there being no groggeries or low houses in their vicinity, and because the host, at whose inn they now and then quenched their thirst, was also a respectable man, usually a large tenant farmer who took pride in his good order, good beer, and early hours. They had their children the whole day at home, and brought them up in obedience and the fear of God. The patriarchal relationship remained undisturbed, so long as the children were unmarried. The young people grew up in idyllic simplicity and intimacy with their playmates until they married, and even though sexual intercourse before marriage almost unfailingly took place, this happened only when the moral obligation of marriage was recognized on both sides, and a subsequent wedding made everything good. In short, the English industrial workers of those days lived, and thought after the fashion still, to be found here and there in Germany, in retirement and seclusion, without mental activity, and without violent fluctuations in their position in life. They could rarely read, and far more rarely write, went regularly to church, never talked politics, never conspired, never thought, delighted in physical exercises, listened with inherited reverence when the Bible was read, and were, in their unquestioning humility, exceedingly well disposed towards the superior classes. But intellectually, they were dead, lived only for their petty, private interest, for their looms and gardens, and knew nothing of the mighty movement which, beyond their horizon, was sweeping through mankind. They were comfortable in their silent vegetation, and but for the Industrial Revolution they would never have emerged from this existence, which, cosily romantic as it was nevertheless not worthy of human beings. In truth, they were not human beings, they were merely toiling machines in the service of the few aristocrats who had guided history down to that time. The Industrial Revolution has simply carried this out to its logical end, by making the workers' machines pure and simple, taking from them the last trace of independent activity, and so forcing them to think, and demand a position worthy of men. As in France politics, so in England manufacture, and the movement of civil society in general drew into the whirl of history the last classes which had remained sunk in apathetic indifference to the universal interests of mankind. The first invention which gave rise to a radical change in the state of the English workers was the jenny, invented in the year 1764 by a weaver, James Hargreaves, of Standhill, near Blackburn, in North Lancashire. This machine was the rough beginning of the later invented mule, and was moved by hand. Instead of one spindle like the ordinary spinning wheel, it carried 16 or 18 manipulated by a single workman. This invention made it possible to deliver more yarn than heretofore. Whereas, though one weaver had employed 3 spinners, there had never been enough yarn, and the weaver had often been obliged to wait for it, there was now more yarn to be had than could be woven by the available workers. The demand for woven goods, already increasing, rose yet more in consequence of the cheapness of these goods, which cheapness, in turn, was the outcome of the diminished cost of producing the yarn. More weavers were needed, and weavers' wages rose. Now that the weaver could earn more at his loom, he gradually abandoned his farming, and gave his whole time to weaving. At that time a family of 4 grown persons and 2 children who were set to spooling could earn, with 8 hours daily work, £4 in a week, and often more, if trade was good and work pressed. It happened often enough, that a single weaver earned £2 a week at his loom. By degrees the class of farming weavers wholly disappeared, and was merged in the newly arising class of weavers who lived wholly upon wages, had no property whatever, not even the pretended property of a holding, and so became working men, proletarians. Moreover, the old relation between spinner and weaver was destroyed. Hitherto, so far as this had been possible, yarn had been spun and woven under one roof. Now that the jenny as well as the loom required a strong hand, men began to spin, and whole families lived by spinning, while others laid the antiquated, superseded spinning wheel aside, and, if they had not means of purchasing a jenny, were forced to live upon the wages of the father alone. Thus began with spinning and weaving that division of labor which has since been so infinitely perfected. While the industrial proletariat was thus developing with the first still very imperfect machine, the same machine gave rise to the agricultural proletariat. There had, hitherto, been a vast number of small landowners, yeomen, who had vegetated in the same unthinking quiet as their neighbors, the farming weavers. They cultivated their scraps of land quite after the ancient and inefficient fashion of their ancestors, and opposed every change with the obstinacy peculiar